Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Gameweek 28 what we've learned video. We've done it 7 game weeks ago, so I just thought it would be a good time to update on, first of all, the understanding of fixtures and what the impacts of potential blanks and doubles will be later in this season, and what I would just generally speak about that. Then we'll jump into sort of player ratings, almost just looking at, I think, topical things in terms of key players who are overperforming, underperforming on finishing, also looking at just their underlying numbers. Of course, that is not an exhaustive list of who I think are good in the game. The cheat sheet reflects things like penalty takers, set piece takers, and just simply the reality of fixtures and doubles and things like that. I will also then round out quickly with the team ratings, mostly the changes from 21 to 28 and where I kind of see teams at now, and then just generally a kind of fixture schedule recap as we head towards game week 32, which I think is going to be quite a popular wildcard window, but maybe the popular strategy, generally speaking, is a wildcard between 30 and 32. Some people, of course, who are going on a free at 29 trajectory are probably going to wildcard a little bit later, given the impact of the free hit. But once again, let's just jump into the video. So for starters, we'll look into kind of the fixture schedule. The impacts of the FA Cup fixtures that happened up until the 3rd of March, which is when I'm recording this video. I'm recording this video right after Nottingham Forest Ipswich has just culminated. Nottingham Forest just won on penalties, and now we have our FA Cup quarterfinal draw. The importance of this quarterfinal draw is that the teams that actually make it to the semi-final will then most likely blank in game week 34, and of course their opponents will therefore as well blank in game week 34. So the impact of that, really, when we look at these quarterfinals, is, you know, Brighton versus Nottingham Forest is a very close game, so the blank that's created there is quite open. It's either going to be Brighton versus West Ham or Nottingham Forest versus Brentford. The Preston Aston Villa game is most likely going to be just an Aston Villa match, and I think crucially Aston Villa face versus Man City in game week 34. So actually the chances that we have a confirmed blank in game week 34 really sits within that one game there, which feels like a guaranteed double to happen in game week 33. Then we've got Fulham versus Crystal Palace, and the impact of Crystal Palace is that they're a team that can double quite a lot over the course of the season. We already know that they doubled in game week 32. It's also probable that they also double once again in game week 33. And I think crucially, when we're looking at the schedule, the expected blanks for game week 34 right now are as such, right? Man City versus Aston Villa, which I mentioned, that has a 94% chance of being a blank. Bournemouth versus United, that has a 37% chance of being a blank. United being knocked out of the FA Cup has sort of reduced the impact of that blank happening, and of course Bournemouth have to beat Man City, which is reflected within that sort of 37%. In the Newcastle versus Ipswich game, that's just going to be a confirmed fixture now, so that means you no longer will have the opportunity to have a double for Newcastle for the rest of the season, right? A lot of us were estimating that maybe you could go on Eddie Howe for gaming 32 and gaming 33 as a manager, or that you'd carry through all your triple Newcastle players on gaming 32 towards gaming 33. The impact of them losing in the FA Cup, and then also Ipswich subsequently losing the FA Cup as well, just means that that's not going to happen. You might need to reevaluate your strategy when it comes to the ownership of Newcastle players. As far as Arsenal versus Crystal Palace, that's got a 49% chance, and that's simply because the Crystal Palace versus Fulham game is going to be close based on betting odds, and so on and so forth. And as you can see, the kind of inverse of that reflected within the Southampton versus Fulham. And then Nottingham Forest versus Brentford, that's the 41% versus the 59% for Brighton to face off versus West Ham. You know, a lot of people might have a lot of confidence in Nottingham Forest because of their previous head-to-head game versus Brighton, but I don't think that that's reflective of anything, really. It's going to be a completely different game. Brighton are going to have a much better squad. They've also played significantly better recently, and I just think, yeah, no point sort of hedging yourself towards thinking that Nottingham Forest are going to win. Brighton have a pretty good chance as well of making it to the semi-finals. So the impact of that is quite fundamental, because I think we can't really be sure which games are going to happen. They're quite even right now in terms of the probabilities. So one of the thoughts that I would outline right now is we can't really say that there's going to be an optimal looking wildcard team on 30, 31, 32. You're going to have an understanding on 30, 31, 32 probably of the rest of the landscape, and therefore you can build a wildcard. But as of right now, you can't really say, you know, what team to build, what teams to target, and even what free hit strategy to go for. I would say that actually what what this has sort of opened up is the idea that you can still maybe actually use the free hit on 33 in the double, depending on which doubles we get. It might even be the case that we just use it on the traditional blank in 34. You could be using it on 29, as I mentioned previously, but equally, you could also just be using a free hit on something like 32. And that's because if you don't really want to carry forward too many of those Newcastle and Crystal Palace players, depending on whether Crystal Palace have a double, things like that, then of course you might actually want to use the free hit on 32. That could be a strategy that can help you keep Salah in your teams as well. And I think that's quite interesting. So right now, I would say that the fixture strategy in the game is not as set in stone as in previous seasons, because I would say it's very much open to what you want to do, which players you want to carry in your teams, which players you want to ignore, which players you're happy with ignoring. But this is sort of the outline of the schedule. And I think crucially, what I can really say as an outcome of this is that bench boost also has to be used probably on one of these fixtures. Maybe let's say still game week 33, where you expect a big fixture. But if you're planning to free hit there, you'd probably have to plan around that. Maybe a bench boost on 32, maybe a bench boost on a single game week. That's kind of the impact of the chip. It's also reduced the windows for triple captaincy. So this week you've got Salah versus Southampton, potentially with reduced minutes, but that still is going to be a great opportunity as a single game week captaincy. So lots of things to think about right now. In terms of assistant manager chip usage, I would still use it over the doubles around 33 and 32. And that's because you'll have table bonus opportunities with Crystal Palace anyways, and you'll also have doubles, right? So that's kind of what I would say is the outcome of all these chip impacts. And let's just move on towards the kind of player level data and the observations from that. So this time round, I'd like to give an update on player finishing. This is sort of just a recurring segment to kind of show, I think, to people who might not look at data very often, what the impact is of overperformance and how we can kind of look into that. Last time round, when I was recording this video, Chris Wood was actually, I believe, fourth in terms of player finishing. He only had outperformed by 3.8 goals. He's now 6.8 and now the sort of leading overperformer in the Premier League. And that just shows you how things change so quickly within the Premier League. I even showed Chris Wood's sort of historic level of finishing, and it was very much in line with his XG this season. Massive overperformance. And honestly, I mean, that's a credit to him, right? That can happen, though, in terms of one outlying season. You have no idea really of where the trajectory of that will go. I remember even featuring at this point in time in Gameweek 21, looking at this sort of graphic here for the bottom finishers. When you look at this metric here, that a lot of players within Bournemouth were all within this bottom finishing category in terms of the top 10 players that I would say are FPL relevant that have overperformed, and top 10 players that are FPL underperformers. I've excluded some players clearly because I just don't think it's relevant to have all these players that we're not going to have within our FPL teams, like Sandro Tonali within the graphics. So do excuse that, but the data is correct. What I would mention, though, is when you're looking at this, all the Bournemouth players like Kluivert, Semenyo, even Dango Ouattara were all within the bottom aspect. Marcus Tavernier is still a bottom finisher, but actually, crucially, his peers are no longer here. So it just shows you how quickly things change and how our comfort in terms of looking at just pure results, such as goals scored or assists created, is, I think, not as predictive potentially as just looking at underlying stats. And that's a very interesting thing. So some of the newcomers within this list would be Rashford, Nwaneri, even Gakpo with some sort of great finishes recently. And then, you know, people who have been reoccurring within this list are players like Eze, players like Bruno. Varney new here as well. Probably that Man City game quite a ways back, quite a big significant factor into that. And then just once you go into the territory of the -1.x's, I mean, that can change on a dime, on a game, on a shot, and I think is mostly irrelevant in terms of discussion finishing. I will say that Odegaard has been a historic positive finisher. So is Nkunku, so is Jota. So it just shows you that things can happen and your understanding of players can change radically, even over the course of a season, but also season to season. So that's kind of the list. Salah also now firmly putting himself within the top finisher list, which is expected given the crazy season he's had. The overperformance for Salah has mostly been within assists, to be honest. But I think that's just more so a credit towards his teammates because he's not in charge of who's taking the shots, right? Player finishing is really what we're looking at here. Overperformance of assists is something that I think is not really predictive at all. When we talk about predictiveness of finishing, I think we're looking at consistent, sustained seasons of overperformance. And right now, I don't think we can say that there's too many players in this list outside of maybe Phil Foden who are sort of reoccurring positive finishers. It is looking likely, if you're just watching the football, that players like Cunha, Nwaneri could see themselves on these lists going forwards. Even Rodgers, for example, Isak and Mbumo as well. But just the tail of the tape so far this season in terms of player finishing. The next thing we're going to look at is underlying performance and a sort of underlying goal involvement overall. What we're looking at is non-penalty expected goals, so obviously not taking into account penalties, and then expected assisted goals, which is really looking at sort of the quality of the pass in terms of the final finishing position of the shot taker. I've separated this graphic into midfielders and forwards, so I just felt like it'd be easier if I went through the forwards first, then jumped into the midfielders. Last time around, I only looked at, I think, maybe the top 15 players, and I was agnostic towards the position in FPL, but I think it's a lot easier if I just go through by position, given that the landscape is a little bit murkier now, and I think we're looking at specifically players to fill out certain positions within our teams. Now, what I would like to mention is Haaland has now found himself back to the top. At one point, I remember Isak actually pipping him slightly in terms of expected goal involvement, mostly due to his sort of involvement from a kind of a creative standpoint from an XAG. Haaland is now firmly number one, and I think one of the consistent themes of this season is that Man City's offense has stayed resolute, right? They've dropped off a cliff on defense and have improved a little bit lately, particularly with a lot of the new signings, and you can see the impacts of those players within certain games, like the Newcastle game, for example. But more crucially, yeah, the attack still looks good, Haaland still looks great, and we are closing in on a window where Haaland can be an interesting player from an FPL point of view. Wisa has maintained his absolute excellent levels of performance within FPL and the Premier League. More importantly, he is someone that has shown continuous improvement within his career in terms of improving these baselines and taking over Tony's spot as the sort of central forward player within the team. And it's just really impressive. So he continues to just be a really solid pick, the same way that Mbumo is an extremely solid pick within the game. Watkins, quite good, although when you look at the non-penalties, still lagging behind some of those top options. So it kind of suggests that if he's not on penalties, which I think is still in doubt, that maybe he's not one of the stronger picks, but he could potentially double as well in the near future. Solanke is one of the top picks. He's someone who should be coming back quite soon, I would imagine, and could be quite interesting from an FPL standpoint. So we'll just have to stay tuned, and he's going to be a good pick because mostly when you look at these kind of metrics, you're looking at per 90 metrics, right? So because these are per 90 metrics, I would like to mention that actually not all the center forwards within this list all play 90 minutes. Someone like Gakpo plays much reduced minutes, so actually the fact that he's here is impressive, but then we also need to contextualize that, first of all, he's a bit more assist dominant compared to his peers given his position on the pitch, but also he plays much less minutes. So when you actually kind of equalize for the amount of minutes that certain players play, and Solanke usually being a 95-minute player, that's quite significant, but he'll have to build his match fitness up as well. Kai Havertz is out for the season. I probably should have taken him off of this list, but I just wanted to keep him here just to kind of show what I suppose the theoretical Arsenal centre forward was posting up as numbers before, unfortunately, his season ended. Cunha, insane overperformance this season, but really good baselines, healthy baselines. And I think more crucially, one of the aspects of the game that we don't really look into so much is just the team. The idea that I think you're a talisman is mentioned up a lot. But I think what is crucial about being a talisman is actually the ramifications in terms of bonus. So players like Cunha and Wood, I think, are uniquely well suited to getting maximum bonus within their teams because unfortunately they don't have similar peers in terms of people who create goals and assists consistently. So whenever they find themselves in towards positions where they score, it's very likely they also get maximum bonus. Whereas I suppose within certain other teams, you have slightly more even mixes in terms of goal share, assist share, these sorts of things. Even for example, Cunha is lab grown for it because of the kind of dribbles completed, the fouls drawn aspect of his game. As far as Mateta, Pedro Wood, I actually added Wood here, even though he's not within this sort of top 10 list. He's obviously within the top 11 list right now. But this isn't even actually an 11. I think someone like Welbeck has slightly better numbers than Wood. But I wanted to put Wood here just so that people can kind of visualize from a data perspective how insane Wood has had a season when you contextualize his underlying stats. And a lot of people will say, yes, this is a good reason to ignore XG, but I think actually you can see that there are a few outliers within the game, and we saw that within the overperformance section, but actually most people tend to stick towards the general rule, which is you'll be around where your baselines are, because it's very unlikely that you're so godly of an overperformer season to season, or that we can continue to predict that level of overperformance. A good context for this is when you look at some of the other overperformers, not many of the overperformers have really moved from when we last sort of looked at overperformance. And Wood was the one who was a significant mover from then till now. And I even mentioned some of the players from the underperformance list moving very, very rapidly off of that due to just certain finishes within certain games, like Bournemouth when they kind of smashed Newcastle and Nottingham Forest back to back. With Mateta, Pedro, Wood, I think these are just very solid players. You're looking at penalty takers, so of course there's added value there inherently, and the minutes for Mateta have been really good. Pedro seems like he's maybe getting his starting spot within the team back, and also as a penalty taker. So he's quite similar to Cunha in the sense that underlying data isn't great, particularly when you're looking exclusively at NPXG, but he's a creative player, and that can have really positive impacts towards bonus as well. And Wood is Wood, so we've kept him there for reference. In terms of the midfielders, shifting over to that, we have Salah reigning supreme. Palmer has dropped off quite a little bit in terms of coming close towards Salah in terms of underlyings, and that just shows you the insane season that Salah has really had from an underlying point of view. Yes, of course, he's overperformed on both goals and assists, but that doesn't really matter. He's still outright the best player in the game, and that's just a credit to him and his performance, as well as Slot and his ability, I think, to manage the squad, but also extract, once again, a great Mo Salah season at this stage of his career, at this age. With Palmer, he's clearly dropped off a little bit, but I think not so much. And once again, given that he's on penalties, yes, of course, he's had a pretty poor blip in terms of finishing, but I would tend to say that we still have a lot of confidence in someone like Cole Palmer. There are still good fixtures to come for Cole Palmer. So is he a player that you need to rapidly sell? No, but I think some people will definitely be looking at a decision very, very shortly, which is, to sell Salah or to sell Palmer. I'm sure a lot of people feel much more comfortable selling Palmer, and I totally get that. But it's just also just a reflection right now of just looking at the season so far from an underlying point of view. As far as Ouattara, he's an interesting one because I think actually his minutes might be very precarious. We have Tavernier playing wing minutes. We have Brooks as well, who has sort of inserted himself into being able to get consistent minutes within the team. And then Evan Nilsson has joined back, even started the game versus Wolves within the FA Cup and played 67 minutes, I believe. So that already is a significant detriment towards Ouattara, but he could still play within the wing positions, right? He is a player who very much was not a center forward before he joined Bournemouth and has always been playing even on the right wing or left wing. So I think it's very possible that Ouattara can still continue to be a really good pick in FPL as long as he gets minutes, but he needs to start, and that's a big asterisk right now. With Son, you've got someone like Odegaard coming in, and therefore I think even his minutes are a little bit asterisk because of his age and because of the rotation that the demands of the European schedule will kind of command over Spurs. As far as Bukayo Saka, he's coming back soon, hopefully after the international break. So just keeping him here for reference. He was actually, as you can see here, the leading player in terms of expected assisted goals per 90, not too far off, obviously, from Salah and Son. And I think what's impressive about Salah and what he's done within the season is that he's not on things like set pieces. He's not on things like corners that kind of inflate your expected assisted goals. So Salah's open play performance has just been absolutely radically insane. Savio has been pretty poor in terms of finishing. So we did see him previously in the sort of poor finishing list, but has been very, very productive as a player just in terms of underlyings. I tend to think, just from my point of view, watching him in La Liga, that I don't think he's a poor finisher. I think that you can really say that it's going to be a consistent theme of his. So I think the fact that we have potential City doubles just means he's a very interesting pick to consider. With Brennan Johnson, once again, he's one of the midfielders who is an absolute outlier when it comes to racking up expected goals. That is his job. That is what he's good at doing, and he's back, and it's interesting. But there's a lot of depth right now for Spurs, so I think once again, one to sort of reconsider. With Minte, he's an interesting one because really good production, really good minutes so far, and we might have a Brighton double, as I mentioned, with Brighton versus West Ham, a potential double Gameweek 33 fixture if, let's say, Brighton beat Nottingham Forest within the next round of the FA Cup. And that's quite important because that could make Minte someone that we could be looking at, someone either on the free hit or someone just naturally within your team on Gameweek 33. Sarr is also up there, so really impressive season with him overall. This is mostly open play performance, so once again, it seemed like his minutes were dipping recently, but I think he's also kind of picked his spot back up within the team. And no Mateta, of course, kind of allows players like Nketiah to play, which also means less depth in terms of substitutions. So he's actually had a kind of up and down season. I think, unfortunately, when a lot of people owned him for the good fixtures, he just wasn't able to deliver, and a lot of people sold him, and then he scores a brace. So that's kind of how FPL is as a game, but it just shows you that there's actually a lot of logic towards owning players like Ismail Sarr, and unfortunately, you might get the unfortunate run of the poor finishing, and it's not your fault, I don't think. At least that's my point of view on certain things, but you just have to deal with the outcomes as they go. And the same applies to someone like Semenyo, who is quite close up there within this list. Foden a little bit lagging behind, and I think crucially, his minutes do seem a little bit more suspect now that there's a little bit more depth involved within the team, now that KDB is playing a little bit better as well. I actually would say that KDB would have easily found himself within the top 5 of this list, but I did take him out because I still think that his minutes are very much suspect at this sort of age, and just from what we've seen so far this season from KDB. But he would be up there in this list, but I have sort of pre-filtered it as well. So that's a good sort of recap of the player side of things for the season. And I think when we're looking ahead and projecting towards these doubles, just interesting to see that there's a lot of players, for example, from the teams that we've mentioned that could double, like Man City, that could be interesting, like even as Savio. From, let's say, the kind of Bournemouth point of view, we're also looking at a lot of the players that we've been previously discussing on, and the defenders in terms of, let's say, Crystal Palace. Sarr could be of interest sometime soon. Eze as well, particularly since if Mateta's out for maybe 1 or 2 games, you're looking at maybe Eze beyond penalties for some really, really good games of football as well. As far as, let's say, Nottingham Forest, I don't think there's anything too exceptional outside of Wood to really go for from an attacking point of view. Yes, of course, Gibbs White has had a really good season so far. So is Elliot Anderson, or even some of the wingers within Elanga and Cho, but I'm not really sure if they're players that we love. And also, I think Ben Crellin has mentioned that actually it's very likely that this Nottingham Forest versus Brentford game, even if it was to be a blank in Game Week 34 on paper, because of the FA Cup semi-final sort of involvement, actually it could still sort of land within Game Week 34. That's sort of Ben's thoughts. So very, very important to sort of regard. As far as, let's say, a team like Fulham or a team like Brighton, I think we're still looking at players like, unfortunately, I've filtered out Jimenez because his minutes have been a bit reduced and we're seeing a lot more competition with Muniz. But players like Smith Rowe, Iwobi are still going to be quite interesting just because of the impact of doubling fixtures. So do keep that in mind. But right now, a good recap of the sort of player involvement, and then we'll just jump into the sort of team data side of things. So what I wanted to do with the team section is something a little bit different. 11ify actually has some really, really beautiful looking graphs when it comes to team level data, where he kind of shows the weekly change on an attacking and defensive point of view. And you can kind of see the improvement in terms of expected goals per game that a team has. So from an attacking point of view, you generally want to see that the line moves upwards, and the upward slope just reflects increasingly higher average expectations in terms of expected goals, and it's just a good reflection of the team's attack. If it goes down in terms of this metric here for attack, it's just a general suggestion that the attack has dropped off. And what I wanted to do was actually look at Game Week 21 as that sort of start point towards Game Week 28 now, where we're kind of looking at teams and how things have progressed. The most important trends that I've really noted is a significant worsening of Aston Villa as a team, Arsenal as a team from an offensive point of view. I think with Aston Villa, it's an interesting one where I think they probably just had slightly tougher fixtures, if I'm being fair to them. And maybe it makes sense why there's been a general drop-off within the team. They actually have a lot of reinforcements like Asensio and Rashford, and I am cautiously sort of expecting that they'll probably improve a little bit in terms of offense. With Arsenal, I think this is very much synced within the injuries. They've just gotten consistently worse and worse throughout the season, and you can kind of see big inflection points like when Saka got injured, all the way towards recently where they're basically just playing 3 men. And unfortunately, one of the 3 men is a youngster who's 17, and you can see a refusal to play Sterling because he's just not very good at football right now. Bournemouth, we've seen a slight improvement there, so quite interesting. A lot of sort of peaks and troughs within certain teams that I don't think are really worth mentioning, but Crystal Palace and Everton, I'd like to mention from Game Week 21, have just radically improved as teams. And clearly with Crystal Palace, I think that's generally, I think, a team building collective rhythm at the start of the season. I think, if we're being honest, Crystal Palace was a team that we probably expected to do a lot better, but then actually performed really poorly. And of course, Mateta is injured now, but I think they've built on a very collective and positive set of recent results, and are kind of going back to sort of reaching the preseason level of expectations and actually overachieving now. So the narrative previously was that the attack just wasn't going to work without Olise, and I think they're pretty cohesive now. Sarr also finding goal involvements as well, despite actually always having really good underlying data. With Everton, I think that's clearly the Moyes appointment. There's nothing else to say there. Extremely impressive improvement. Beto also delivering in terms of goals. Same with Ndiaye. So nice little sort of shifts there. The big other trend that I would mention is huge drop off in terms of all these sort of relegation bound teams within Ipswich, Leicester, and Southampton. Crucially, the exercise that makes it very tricky with team models is that you have teams who are involved within the championship and they have underlying data within the championship. Then you also kind of have to set an average expectation for what a promoted team within the championship can achieve within the Premier League. And over the course of the season, I think they've just consistently sort of failed to deliver on those kind of expectations. And you can see that the reality with these teams is that they're just a lot worse than we expected, but they've also gotten consistently worse within the season. And Leicester, I think, is a good example of that. Southampton as well. So it just shows you how bad really things can get and that they can just get worse. I don't think people would have said that when, let's say, Southampton or Leicester sacked their managers, but there you have it. McKenna with slightly less sort of, I guess, aggressive levels of worsening. Spurs probably, I would say, fixture and injury related as well in terms of their sort of worsening. Same with Liverpool too, where I don't think it's really fair to say Liverpool have dropped off that significantly in terms of offense. You can see just generally over the course of the season, peaks and troughs, and that's expected. With Nottingham Forest, a gradual improvement actually in terms of the attacking rating, which is really good, and City sort of flatlining from Gameweek 21, so nothing has really changed from sort of our previous perception. And then Wolves also with a slight improvement, Man United with, once again, a consistent worsening. And this is really impressive because 11.5's model is actually, not paying attention to market data, so he's always rated Man United worse than the markets. And the fact that Man United's baselines have continued to drop just shows you really how far they've fallen as a team. And you can kind of see that their baselines, are bottom half baselines when you compare it to some of the other teams, and where they sit in terms of how the graph looks and kind of what the statistical points are in terms of the y-axis. So very interesting. As far as the defense, shifting over to that, well, one of the things that I'll mention with these graphics is that these team rating graphics are slightly different towards the attack, right? If you see a team moving down within the slope, it actually just means that they're actually getting better and better as a defense. So that's actually really impressive, as opposed to in the previous chart where if they were going down, it was a signifier of them being a worse attack. Here, this is sort of a reflection that the further down you go, the better of a defense you are, because the general expectation is that your expected goals conceded is going to reduce, which means that you're reducing the amount of opportunities you face per game. So as far as, let's say, or quality opportunities, as far as Arsenal, they've actually very impressively just maintained an insane level as a defense. And I think what's so impressive is that over the course of the season, they've actually improved as a defense. And as you can see as well, probably the more attacking injuries they've had, the more they've had to result in actually probably grinding out defensive results and maybe playing more defensively. A lot of people like to mention this, and I think the big distinction is that a team like Arsenal can play defensively, but they're still an elite defense. Relegation teams all try to defend, but I don't think they do it very well at all. And you can kind of see that game to game. Within a team like Aston Villa, we can see slightly worsening in terms of the defense and overall just a general worsening of performance over the last maybe 6-7 weeks. So something interesting. I think they've gotten a lot of new recruitments, and unfortunately they had a lot of key defensive injuries, which I think is actually probably more significant for this Aston Villa team. Some midfield injuries as well. So I think that's a little bit of unluckiness, and I'm expecting them to sort of claw back towards a decent level of performance. With Bournemouth, a consistent improvement over the course of the season. So once again, a very impressive trend. With Crystal Palace and Everton, I think what's astounding is that, yeah, under Moyes, you've actually seen still continued improvement in terms of defense, but then also what's impressive with these teams is that you're not seeing, let's say, a shift in terms of attack and then a clawback in terms of defense. You're actually seeing general improvement within Crystal Palace and Everton on their defensive baselines, and that's very impressive. Brighton as well, with a slight improvement in defense, but nothing too significant. Fulham, over the course of the season, have proven themselves to be a very elite defense. One of the big changes that I'll mention in terms of just the outright Premier League data within the teams is that Fulham, I think, right now are now third in terms of expected goals conceded. So they're actually ahead of Nottingham Forest. And I think a lot of people probably in their minds mentally have Nottingham Forest as a much better team defensively than Fulham, and maybe that's not actually the case. I tend to trust the data, so I'm totally happy with Fulham being maybe on the same par as Nottingham Forest. But I'm sure a lot of people have different perceptions of that because of the amount of clean sheets that Nottingham Forest have, but just an interesting development over the course of the season. Ipswich, Leicester, Ipswich has sort of maintained themselves. So once again, the general trend here is that Leicester and Southampton have gotten much worse. Liverpool have actually gotten consistently better and better in terms of defense, and that's really impressive from Gameweek 21. they have conceded a fair few goals, but actually it just shows you that game to game, the amount of quality chances that are giving to opponents is reducing and reducing based on the expectations that we have, even against the sort of fixture adjusted difficulty. So very impressive with United, just a worsening of the team. Probably also, once again, injury related. You've got also the Sandro injury, and just, I think generally, even if you lose key attackers, that has an impact sometimes in defense for many reasons. Like Amadiello was a very good presser of the ball. Many other aspects as well. As far as, let's say, Newcastle, we have a bit of a yo-yoing, so I don't think there's too much to really say there. Nottingham Forest, a little bit of a clawback in terms of continued improvement over the course of the season, but then actually over the last maybe 6-7 game weeks, a little bit of a flattening, and we'll continue to see where they kind of move. As far as Spurs, they've gotten worse and worse, but they're also getting a lot of players back, and maybe they can actually build on this finally in terms of improving their actual underlying and sort of data-wise form, and maybe we can have a different expectation of Spurs. As far as, let's say, teams like Wolves, they've actually improved, and so have West Ham, and I think that's very much related to appointments as well. So Wolves and West Ham under Potter and Pereira respectively, or Pereira and Potter respectively, have improved, which is very impressive. And that's all I really have to say in terms of interesting trends. I think with City as well, as I mentioned, it seems like they're on the right track, but slowly sort of building up some good results. I also saw Rodri was training in grass. I don't think he's going to make an impact in terms of the Premier League, but just a nice positive sign to sort of mention as well so far. But the most sort of impressive improvements really from a Gameweek 21 point of view, I would have to say, would still have to be quite an improvement in terms of Brentford, Everton, Crystal Palace. Other than that, I wouldn't say there were anything too impactful outside of West Ham and Wolves as well in terms of improvements in terms of defense. In terms of worsenings of defense, we know it's mostly the relegation teams like Leicester and Southampton, and then also Man United, mostly injury related, Spurs as well. So just something to mention in terms of teams. Now, to round things off in terms of this team discussion, I mean, it's useful to get an overall picture of the teams as well. So I'm just going to show the graphics in terms of the overall team strength like I usually do, and you can kind of see where these teams are at, both from the attacking and defensive point of view. I think we all know where teams are situated. What I would mention is that actually we now have a lot more teams in the Premier League that are much stronger in terms of defense, and they're now a lot more consistently sort of placing themselves as a defensive team alongside your traditional top six. Whereas previously in the past, we usually tend to only see Crystal Palace and Everton within this kind of quadrant at the top left, which is basically, you know, a better defense and a worse attack. Now we have a lot more balance within the Premier League in terms of the amount of teams there, and a lot more parity where you can actually see that, you know, teams like Bournemouth, Newcastle, and Chelsea maybe are still actually worse from a defensive point of view compared to the likes of Crystal Palace, Nottingham Forest, Fulham, or Everton, but they still have that sort of leeway there in terms of being a good offense and a much better offense as well. So very interesting to kind of look at these kind of graphics. What I would say is also very helpful to round off this video is to just simply look at the kind of fixture difficulty lying up ahead for certain teams. I will once again divide this by the attack and defense rating. Once again, all the credit goes towards Elevenify and his wonderful team model, but we can have a look at some of the future game weeks as well. What I will mention too is Game Week 32 will have doubles. Game Week 33 will have doubles, so it's probably a little bit easier right now to just focus towards maybe the next 4 game weeks in a row. I'm looking at Game Week 28 towards Game Week 31, where, yes, of course, you might be wildcarding on 30. You might be wildcarding on 31, so ignore it. You might be wildcarding on 32, so ignore, I guess, nothing, because you probably have to care about all of these games. But just something that's quite important, where we're close towards the territory where a lot of us are going to be wildcarding. The idea here is that we focus on what we want to be dead ending into. We want to focus into players that can actually serve us up until this wildcard, and we just maximize the run of games, giving ourselves the best chances possible. So what I would mention here from effectively, let's say, a goals point of view is that from, let's say, Game Week 28, I think the only key trends is that it's just an amazing game exceptionally for Liverpool and Chelsea. It probably makes sense to invest into Chelsea, even though it does seem like that there's an immediate clawback to that in Game Week 29 with Arsenal, so that's quite significant. But generally, actually, I think over the kind of overall curve within heading towards Game Week 32, is that actually Crystal Palace are pretty high up there in terms of offense. I would also mention that Bournemouth are exceptional as well, heading up towards Game Week 32. Spurs, crucially, have an amazing game in Game Week 31, so it really depends on whether you're capturing Game Week 31 for them. And once again, this goes back to the idea of you need to kind of have a look at your team, decide what maybe kind of wild card you're aiming towards or loosely aiming towards, and then kind of set up a plan for which players can be quite useful for you, or when you'd like to pick up players crucially. For example, the idea of Spurs is, I think Gameweek 31 could be an amazing dead end for certain players, whereas if you're not going for, let's say, a wildcard 32, you're going to ignore Spurs entirely. In the meantime, of course, Arsenal, pretty decent numbers, Brighton, pretty decent numbers, Bournemouth, more impressive, Newcastle, more impressive as well, heading up towards Gameweek 32, where Newcastle do double. West Ham, Brentford also have some pretty okay fixtures, so do Aston Villa, but nothing too exceptional. And unfortunately, with the loss of Cunha, I wouldn't quite recommend anyone from Wolves. Strand Larson is clearly going to be the key player there, but that's pretty much it. As far as the defensive point of view, I think the only thing that I'd really mention as a bit of a difference is, once again, Crystal Palace just even more impressive on defense, Bournemouth as well, but then crucially Forest. If you have not been previously invested in towards Forest or even Wolves, I think you've got options like Nico Williams and Ait Nouri, who are very, very interesting from both teams that I would definitely look towards. And Everton, once again, a pretty solid team, just generally speaking, heading up towards Gameweek 32, where you can be thinking about their players. And that's pretty much all I would mention from a team point of view. A lot of the metrics, as I mentioned, are very kindly provided by 11ify, and you can get access to all these sort of levels of advanced data within his website. And once again, shout outs go to him. Other than that, thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you were able to kind of learn a little bit more about the sort of fixture landscape, the sort of gradual development of players within the league and their sort of progress, I suppose, within the season. Same with teams. And I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead as we head towards a week with a lot of European fixtures that can have huge impacts in terms of cheat sheets. We saw the impact of cup games very surprisingly over the weekend, with players like Cunha, Mateta, unfortunately being sidelined for a while potentially. And you can see it is very helpful to get as much information as possible and to react on that adequately. So the cheat sheet will come a little bit later this week, but stay tuned for more content. And I hope you guys, once again, have a great weekend.